All right, the clock has struck 7 and we do have a quorum, so if you want to get started.
All right, well, let's bring the Tumwater Tree Board meeting to a start. Let's do a call of order. I'll let everybody say who's there in person. And then we'll go through, well, Tanya's on here. Not everybody there.
Present is Mike Jackson, Hannah Oman, and Jim Sedor, and me, Alyssa Millwood.
Okay, and does that mean we have 2 absent? Brett's not here,
Yeah. And Brody is also not here.
All right. Okay, let's see. Roll call. Any changes to the agenda tonight?
Any changes to the agenda tonight? Everyone chose to sit on the side of the room that doesn't have the mic. Yeah. Anyone have any changes to the agenda?
No.
No changes to the agenda, Chair.
Okay, I see approval minutes, but I was looking through the tree board and I had different, let's see.
We're having a hard time hearing you, Trent.
You can't hear me?
Understanding you.
You can't
We can hear
understand
you,
me?
but we can't quite hear what you're articulating. Now you're muted.
Let me see if I can turn it on mic. Is that better?
I
So
think
far, yes.
Maybe I had it too close to my channel. Okay, so we've got meeting minutes to approve. We've got April 10th, 2023, and well, this one says March 13th. So is that, oh, that was the motion.
The July 10th.
Okay.
Good day.
All right. Does anybody have any changes they want to make to these?
No.
Okay.
No.
No.
Let's just make a motion to approve the meeting minutes from July 10th, 2023 and April 10th, 2023. Second,
So moved.
or all those approved of all those to approve the meeting minutes from April 10th and July 10th, 2023, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Tanya's got her hand raised. I'm guessing that's a yay as well. Those opposed? Nobody? Okay. Motion carries. Approve the meeting minutes with the July 10th, 2023. Next item on the agenda is tree board member reports. Does somebody want to give like a rundown of the site visit from September?
No.
Does anyone want to, were you asking for any feedback from the site visit in September?
Yeah, I didn't go, so I can't say anything, but anybody have anything that they wanted to share about that, or?
I appreciated the staff and their work. We looked at 3 sites, and we talked about collaborating with the staff on identifying best species for the various sites. I thought that we might hear from the staff by now to see if they wanted any advice or they had anything to share with us. I haven't seen anything yet from the staff about planting plans for those 3 sites. So I'm assuming that when they're ready to move forward, they will contact us for any feedback.
Work with Grant to see if I can nudge him along.
There's no rush, but unless they intend to plant this year, I assume, this fall, and they wanted to try to salvage some plants from some proposed developments. So ready whenever they are.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, it would be interesting to see what the city has planned. The coordinators report, is that you?
So the Wildland Urban Interface Code adoption has been delayed by the Washington State Building Code Council until March 15th, 2024. The code updates for the city, the ordinance updates will be on hold until that code is finalized because it will impact whatever it is that we move forward on. So we prefer to wait until that's final. We did put together a letter with the Washington Association of Cities outlining the ways in which we hope that that code can improve or the problems that we see from that code interacting with our existing ordinances and also future hopes for ordinances, such as water availability in any jurisdiction that would be required to do that, and the water rights required for that as one example. So those, the ordinances will not be coming before the tree board until that final piece of code is done at the state level. That timeline does coincide with the legislative session, and some other jurisdictions are talking about potentially introducing some bills to try to improve that. So that's an update on that.
So our consultant that we paid to help us with this, how are they dealing with this?
We've extended the contract so that we still will be within a time frame. They're on hold waiting as well. We can't really do much work without knowing what it'll actually look like. They're being patient and they're still on contract.
I'm assuming that as I interpret the proposed code changes, the laws, we may have to backtrack, particularly in regard to public comment and our own evaluation of how to implement the proposed codes in light of what we plan to do. So I'm assuming that we'll have to reassess whether we use the data or the work that we've done up to now, or if we're going to have to start over.
It's my understanding that we'll be trying to use as much as we possibly can from the momentum that we have. We've engaged people, we've built trust. We want to do everything that we can that will be allowable within the state code, and we're fighting for those obstacles that might be put in place that we feel shouldn't be there. We're trying to get those eliminated if we can, and working with other jurisdictions to make that code finer resolution for property level, taking into consideration heat island effects and how this impacts habitat, as well as water. There's just so many different things that this code touches that we wish that that we're hoping for a better outcome so that we can move forward with the progress that we had made.
Thank you.
Another update is next month, my intern Amita will be presenting the work that you all requested about the street tree hardiness and climate change vulnerability. So they'll come and give a short presentation on that. This is from their internship with me last quarter, and they're interning with me this quarter working on a different project. So it might be a little stale in their mind, but they'll come, and they're excited for the opportunity and really grateful to be able to present to the tree board.
Is there, I think that next month, we were also supposed to address the recommended tree list.
That is part of the things being on hold, with the WUI code, or the Wildland Urban Interface. All of those three codes, our ordinances all speak to each other, so all of them are on hold for the time being. We did submit the draft street tree plan to the State Department of Natural Resources, who provided us the grant to do the work, so that they had a deliverable. And the street tree plan, other than perhaps the list, shouldn't really change, but the list is in a pretty good place, and ready for you all, but we're not going to move any ordinance stuff forward, until they can all kind of move at the same time.
So is the recommended tree list on our website part of an ordinance?
The ordinance refers to a recommended or approved street tree list. And I can tell you that the approved street tree list that we got from the consultant more recently, which was still several months ago, is much expanded, includes some native trees. Some trees have been removed based on the work that Amita did to find about the hardiness. Where the list right now is like, what, 25 trees? This is like trees or more. It's a matrix with a lot more information on it, similar to the street tree list that was included in the Urban Forestry Management Plan. A lot more details.
Thank you.
So that will come forward as soon as all the other ordinances start slowly seeing their way back onto the agendas. And then my other updates are agenda items, so I don't need to take up too much time here. And Chair, we have no members of the public present on Zoom.
Okay, so should we just jump right into the carbon sequestrators? Or-
Sure. And I can introduce carbon sequestration white paper. Yeah. Allison Osterberg, are you senior regional planner now? Actually, why don't you introduce yourself? Allison is wonderful, and she's going to give us a presentation tonight on the carbon sequestration white paper. And I'll stop sharing so you can share.
Thanks so much, Alyssa, and thanks to this group for having me come and talk about this project today. My name is Allison Osterberg, and I'm now the planning manager at Thurston Regional Planning Council. But I worked on this project as a planner a few years ago with other folks involved in the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, and happy to present on it. Let me pull up my slides. You guys all see that all right?
Yes.
All right. So
Great.
I'll give a little background on the project. I'll give a little context from why we were asking the questions we were, and context from the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan. A little information about some of the analysis we did to develop a baseline sequestration for the Thurston County region and trying to assess what the potential might be for more carbon sequestration here, and go a little bit into some of the conclusions and recommendations that were put forward in the report. But before I get into that, I just want to maybe start with a little bit of a caveat. I am a land use planner and communications person and an English major and liberal arts major. And so I just want to be really clear and upfront that this report was developed from a place of not that we TRPC are experts in carbon sequestration or carbon cycle or all of what goes into that. And I know there are folks on this board with a lot more expertise in that area. We were really looking at it from the space of, well, we have these policy recommendations that we made in this plan, and for jurisdictions, what would be the next first steps to get into it? And something I learned in working on this with my colleagues is that once you get into carbon sequestration, you very quickly go down, it's very easy to go down a number of rabbit holes around that are very tied in with calculations and I very frequently found myself feeling like the woman in this meme of how do I translate between biomasses and carbon stocks and greenhouse gas equivalencies and all of those things. And so there in the appendices particularly, there's a lot of kind of how we work through some of those. How do we compare? How do we make things so that we're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges when we're thinking of putting together a lot of these different analyses? And so if you're looking into carbon sequestration and it feels very confusing, know that you're not alone. And if you are an expert in this kind of field and have light to shed on it, know that your input is very welcome. So what is carbon sequestration? At heart, it's a process that takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and stores it somewhere else. It's a natural process that occurs all the time. And it could also be an artificial process that's made to happen for various purposes. And so in general, when we're talking about it in this context, we're looking at anything that's removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it in either a natural or artificial sink, somewhere that it would be stored longer term and not in the atmosphere. And that could be soil, it could be vegetation, it could be the ocean, could be there are lots of other ways that carbon sequestration is done. And there are lots of other terms that people use for it in different fields. But one thing I want to highlight from our context and looking at it from a climate change perspective is that the fact that we're looking into carbon sequestration as a climate mitigation strategy in the Thurston County region, it was kind of not something originally that was on a lot of folks' radar. It wasn't a big part of the plan when it was originally scoped, but it is a big part of globally what will be needed to reach climate targets that will reduce or help us avoid the most dire predicted impacts from climate change. So the IPCC, which does a lot of the international work around climate change negotiation, all of their modeling and forecasts indicate that carbon sequestration in some form will be needed to meet all modeled pathways to international climate targets. So this is something that's needed on a global scale. And as you'll see, we are looking at what that means on a local level. And I just want to just a little excuse. I'm getting over a cold, which is why I didn't join you all in person today. And so just excuse me if I have to clear my throat every once in a while. There are a couple of terms that come up that are important to think about when talking about carbon sequestration. And there is the term carbon stock, and the carbon stock is when carbon is stored in something. It could be vegetation, soil, rocks, gas, liquids, all kinds of things, but it's stable, it's in some kind of stable fashion. And that is usually measured in tons of carbon. For the purposes of this report, that's what we used. And the other concept that gets used a lot with carbon sequestration is carbon flux. And that is that trying to track the movement of that carbon from one location to another, from one pool to another pool. And so it could be moving from the atmosphere in through photosynthesis into a tree, or it could be moving from down leaves from that tree that are breaking down and then breaking down, and carbon dioxide is moving back up into the atmosphere. And so any of that activity where carbon is moving from one place to another is carbon flux. And so carbon emissions are carbon flux, carbon sequestration is a carbon flux. And that, for the purposes of this paper, are being measured in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's putting it in the language of greenhouse gases per year. And it's important it's being measured on some kind of time frame per year. So it's a change per year. And these two concepts get merged together a lot when people are talking about carbon sequestration. You'll hear a lot and people will say, our forests are so important for carbon sequestration, and they are older, bigger trees are really important for carbon sequestration, and they are. And they're important from the perspective of being carbon stocks. They're big, they're old, they've got a lot of carbon stored up in them, and it's just staying there. And then at the same time, you'll hear people say, or other people will say, no, the most important thing about carbon sequestration is, planting new trees. New trees are more important for carbon sequestration. And that can also be true because new trees draw down more atmosphere, more carbon carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as part of their processes. And so kind of when you look at them isolated, they can have more of that carbon flux. And so sometimes people will try to put these things right next to each other and say, sometimes they're talking about carbon stock, and sometimes they're talking about carbon flux. Both things are important to the carbon sequestration picture when we're thinking about the role of our ecosystems in climate change. For the purposes of, there's lots of different types, as I mentioned, of carbon sequestration. There's terrestrial sequestration, so things that are happening through land processes. You'll hear a lot about oceanic sequestration or blue carbon, and that's where vegetation, for example, in the ocean, carbon will be stored in the ocean through different natural processes there. And there's also different types of geologic sequestration that comes up a lot if you hear people talking about carbon capture, capturing carbon emissions from power plants, sinking it deep into the earth, storing it down there. That's another type of carbon sequestration. For the purposes of the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, we focused on a few different types of terrestrial sequestration. We focused on what happens in forests, in trees, where we have carbon dioxide that gets pulled out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis and then stored, translated into vegetation, into roots, and into the soil. But we also talk a lot about agricultural sequestration. And so are there agricultural practices that perform a lot of the same things, but through agricultural activity? And we also, in the climate mitigation plan, talks about carbon sequestration a little bit that's associated with prairies. And so prairies are a fairly unique ecosystem within Thurston County, but there's lots of prairie ecosystems around the world, and they also contribute a lot of carbon sequestration because many prairie plants have extensive root systems. And that's one way, even though you don't have big, tall plants above the soil, there's a lot of sequestration that's happening underground with them. And so these are the three main forms of carbon sequestration that were called out in the climate mitigation plan. That plan was completed in 2020. It is, excuse me, was developed as a partnership between the cities of Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, and Thurston County, and Thurston Regional Planning Council helped support development of the plan. And that plan set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for the region, set common goals to reduce locally our contributions to climate change, reduce them 45% by 2030 and 2050 and 85% by 2050. And that plan set out 22 different strategies to get there and more than 70 actions. And that plan wrapped up in 2020. And carbon sequestration is a part of that plan, part of how those jurisdictions identified how we will get to meet those targets that were set in the plan. As I mentioned, it has those three main types. Regenerative agriculture was called out, reforestation and afforestation. So both growing more trees where there used to be trees that are not there anymore, and also afforestation, growing trees where there weren't any trees to begin with. And also prairie preservation and restoration. There are several strategies in the plan that talk about carbon sequestration. Strategy A2 that focuses on supporting agricultural practices that sequester carbon. And then there are several strategies that talking about trees, preserving tree canopy, managing forests and prairies to sequester carbon. and some of the assumptions and the discussions that we had when we were developing the plan is that sequestration will be used to offset countywide emissions. So it's not above and beyond. We're seeing it as one of the strategies to say, instead of reducing our locally generated emissions to meet those targets, 45% reduction, 85% reduction, instead of reducing how much greenhouse gas emissions we're emitting to meet those targets all the way, we're going to make up some of that by offsetting it with harnessing the power of our local ecosystems to draw down more carbon from the atmosphere and offset the emissions that we're creating locally to a certain extent. And that was in part recognizing that a lot of work is being done locally around preserving and restoring local ecosystems, and really want to recognize the power that they have. And the other assumption that was built into including carbon sequestration as a strategy is that they would not be traded for emissions occurring outside of Thurston County. So carbon sequestration, if we're saying offsets are part of how we meet those climate change goals, those greenhouse gas reduction goals, if we're talking about carbon sequestration, it's to offset things, it's to offset our own emissions and not in a carbon credit system being used and then purchased by someone outside of Thurston County to offset their own emissions. That's not how we're thinking of it in this context.
Can I ask a question, or do you want to hold questions?
If it's a quick clarifying question about the process, that's fine. Otherwise, I might, I might cover your question later in the presentation.
I think it's short. In the assumptions, is there a strategy to minimize the increase in emissions or to reduce current emissions? Is that a strategy or an assumption?
Well, do you mean just specifically around the natural environment or generally?
Locally.
So I'd say the overall, the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, the targets are mostly focused on reducing emissions, locally generated emissions from the building sector, the transportation sector. Those are our two biggest ones, but also reducing emissions to a certain extent from agriculture, reducing emissions from water and waste processing that happens, and other kinds of sources of emissions. And so that's the main focus of the plan. There is just this one section of the plan that focuses on how to offset some of our emissions that we're generating through carbon sequestration. So, and those other strategies, I think are looking both at how do we, it doesn't kind of look at, given our population growth, if we don't do anything, our emissions would continue to increase. And so the reductions, the way it's looked at in the plan also considers that growth and what might having to think about that population growth. But this question will come back up again. So in the climate mitigation plan, we developed a scenario analysis just to do that, to say, okay, we have these targets, how will we get there? And the policies in the plan, the scenario analysis looked at the impact of some state policies that had recently gone into place. The biggest one of those was the Clean Energy Transformation Act, which is shifting Washington State's electricity sources to renewable energy. But also the building codes. There are some transportation policies that were in there. And there's more things that have gone into place since we did the scenario analysis, but state policies were a big part of that. And then those are the gray bar areas. And then the colored bar areas, we also said, what local policies do we need to get us the rest of the way? And so the way this chart is set up, we've got time over here on the x-axis and how much greenhouse gas emissions we're contributing locally on the Y. And then if these are our countywide greenhouse gas emissions that were going kind of up, up, and up. And if we did nothing, we would expect them to continue to increase, aligned mostly with population growth. State policies we found would do a lot to reduce our local emissions, but not get us to our targets, which were on this dotted line, our 2030 target and our 2050 target. Local policies that reduce local emissions, particularly in the transportation sector, got us enough of the way down to meet our shorter term target, or 2035 target, or our 2030 target, a 45% reduction, but were not sufficient for us to meet the end goal, which was an 85% reduction by 2050. And so that's where carbon sequestration came in. It was, we would need some carbon sequestration to offset some of our emissions to meet that longer term goal. And ultimately we need it to meet, according to that analysis, to offset about 10% of emissions to get to that 2050 target. So within the Thurston Climate Mitigation Plan, it set a target that we would need to sequester 380,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year by 2050. And in order to get there, we did a little bit, but it was real rough. I just want to emphasize this, a little bit of analysis of what would get us there. We looked at maybe what we could do through agricultural soil carbon and estimated that contribute about 3,300 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And then we were really counting on afforestation or reforestation to make the bulk of it, of that amount. And something that I want to make clear is that there wasn't a whole lot. I mean, we did some analysis. Our consultants worked on this to get us to it, but the sequestration question, because it came a little later in the process and it was just something we said, how can we use this as part of our overall portfolio of strategies? And so there were many things that were not included in that estimate. We didn't create an estimate of what current trees, current forests, and other land covers, the way they're contributing to carbon flux on an annual basis. So we didn't have a baseline for what our Thurston County environment's doing now when it comes to sequestration. We didn't have any estimates about what kind of sequestration could be provided by restoring prairies. We knew prairie preservation was important to us in our region. We just didn't have a lot of good data at our fingertips to figure out how could they possibly contribute to this. We didn't look at the role of urban trees versus rural trees in the plan. And we really didn't look at how changes in land use might affect sequestration long term. And that, I think, gets to your question in the room, because Thurston County is a growing county, a developing county. As we know that forest cover and agricultural land we're losing some of it every year. How, if we cast that out to 2050, how might that affect that sequestration picture in the future, and how much more might we need to offset from those changes? So in 2020, we wrapped up the climate mitigation planning process with some burning questions. How much carbon does land in Thurston County sequester? We needed a baseline if we were going to be able to track our progress toward that target. And how much more carbon could certain land covers sequester in the future if we did something different? And then really, what can regional partners even do to meet that sequestration target? It was a really big number. And there were a lot of questions of people feeling like, is this even feasible? Is this something we can do? And so that's what led to the development of this white paper, this research report. And one of the first things we looked at is, can we develop a baseline estimate for what environments in Thurston County, how they contribute to carbon sequestration? And the answer we got to is we partially can do that. We've partially been able to do that. For this process, we use a recently developed tool by ICLEI, which does a lot of work with greenhouse gas protocol development internationally and in the United States. And they developed this tool called LEARN. The LEARN tool uses aerial images and compares them over time to look at change in land use, overall land use, and comes up with some estimates for how those changes in general land use categories translate into changes in carbon sequestration. So areas that were forested in one area and are developed, the next time they come back and look at it, what might be as a loss in that carbon sequestration capacity. And areas that were grasslands and that were turned into, that were settled, how do those change? All those different changes are built into the tool. So we used the Learn tool to develop a baseline sequestration amount. And that baseline is that, so one thing is that the restriction on the Learn tool is that right now the function of it is that it only looks at the role of trees and forests areas. It doesn't really assess changes or increases or decreases in carbon sequestration due to agriculture, to prairies, or other land uses, but it can do trees and forests. And so just looking at trees and forests in Thurston County, that baseline is around 926,800 metric tons of carbon dioxide per year. And at the time, our overall greenhouse gas emissions countywide for the Thurston region was about 3.3 million metric tons of carbon dioxide a year. So this, for comparison, was about a third of our overall emissions was being potentially offset through carbon sequestration. Breaking that down a little bit, when it comes to forests and trees, the bulk of sequestration is being provided by forests in the rural areas. And a smaller part of it is being contributed by trees that are in more urban areas. And those together add up to our sequestration baseline. But to get to the target, to what we want to do in the climate mitigation plan, that we got to go above the baseline. And so what we really need is an additional 375,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide a year. That's the portion that was set in the targets for trees and forests. Above that, almost 1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide a year. That's the baseline. And that's a 40% increase over what we had, according to that baseline estimate. So it's a lot. It's a big increase. So the next question is, what strategies could we use to increase carbon sequestration in the Thurston region? And we did a literature review, some of the analysis and tools that were available, assessing different sequestration strategies, what their potential might be in Washington State, and drawing that down into Thurston County. And so we found a number of actions, some of which were called out in the climate mitigation plan and some that were not. So actions that were in the plan included those that were focused on increasing regenerative agriculture, increase the storage of carbon in soil and vegetation, reforestation and afforestation actions, and prairie preservation. But there were other actions that are not called out in the plan that were also seen to potentially be able to increase sequestration. And that would be in areas that are being managed as for timber harvest, extending the rotation time for that timber harvest. Also avoiding conversion of forests in the first place is a good way to retain your sequestration capacity. And something else that was called out was the potential for doing restoration in tidal areas, in wetlands, particularly in marine areas, that's tying back to that blue carbon form of carbon sequestration. And each of those estimates had sort of a high and a low, in some cases a pretty big range about what might be possible. And our target that we're trying to get to, how much carbon we're trying to draw down by 2050, is down here. And you can see all those actions put together at the high estimate still doesn't quite get us to the target that we have in the plan. So then we looked at, well, what actions could regional partners take to move toward this goal? And we outlined 30 actions. I won't go through all of them. There's some information, and especially in the appendices, there's a little more details about what's in there. But we looked at options around technical assistance and outreach, some regulatory changes that folks could consider, financial incentives, and kind of filling in the gaps in some of the data needs that we saw. And I'll put those into some 4 big buckets that we thought folks could consider sort of as a priority. So one would be to support rural forest conservation and incentive programs, really providing advocacy for the management of those large forest lands. To the large extent, those are not under local control. They're either under private timber management or private ownership, or they're in state lands. And another option would be to look at the feasibility of some incentive programs for things like those longer timber harvests or managing land in a way to preserve carbon sequestration capacity. Second bucket is looking at ways to align existing programs with sequestration goals. So all our jurisdictions are going through their comprehensive plan updates. Tumwater and the county, we're continuing to work on their habitat conservation planning efforts. And there's always the possibility of coming back and reviewing and update the climate mitigation plan. So it was seen that knowing what we know now about carbon sequestration, taking this information and incorporating it into those plans to guide future work would be important. Another area to focus on is to fill some of the data gaps we have. Like I mentioned, the Learn tool gives us a little bit of a picture on forests and trees, but it leaves out some other big categories around land use change. And so doing a full analysis that would help assess the way all of our ecosystems are changing and contributing to carbon sequestration and carbon flux in general would be helpful. Doing a regional tree canopy update, which I'm pleased to, I think some of that work is underway, which is great. And another one we have more information on coming out now is more information about prairie soils. There's not a lot of information that was available on our specific conditions in Thurston County for prairies and how they might contribute to carbon sequestration. And getting a better handle on how to track regenerative agriculture practices. It's another work that, especially at the state level, there's been some more activity around. And finally, we thought it would be important to continue to build relationships with community partners and continue to track those state and federal programs. Some folks asked why there's such a focus on rural forests in the policy recommendations that we have. And we did a little bit of an assessment of land cover and land use in Thurston County, and just some takeaways is that around half of Thurston County, our land area, around half of it is forested. But of that forested land, 93% is in the rural areas. And of that rural forested land, the majority of it, the vast majority of it, 60% is managed for timber harvest. Most of that is private timber companies like Weyerhaeuser and Menke. A lesser but still important part of it is managed by the state, particularly in the Washington State Department of Natural Resources. And so when we didn't really think about things like timber management, because as local government, when we're developing the climate mitigation plan, because as local governments, we're not very involved in that regulatory world, but it's really important when we're thinking about the role of carbon sequestration in our region. And only really 3% of our forests countywide are in a designated park or preserve, or in an area where they're really being protected long-term. Question?
Allison?
Yeah.
You're saying here, I assume that half of Thurston County is forested. That's as of 2018?
Probably. I have to go back and look at what date we used exactly.
Yeah, I'm curious if the report has any data that says, for example, how much of Thurston County was forested 20 years ago?
We do have some of that. We do have some of that data I don't know that we put it in the report, but it is something we track on Thurston Regional Planning Council. If you go to our profile pages, we have some data that we use where we use those large aerial images and look at land use cover change over time. So what we have seen is that generally the amount of area in Thurston County that's forested is going down over time. Although there have been some increases, it's not totally a story that goes in one direction.
Yeah, I would tell us if current policies are significantly reducing the forested land base, or if current policies are increasing the current land base, or, you know, what's happening there. So I think that would be really valuable to know.
Yeah, I can share that. So one thing we were able to look at in that Learn tool is you could compare different time frames. And I don't think we went back 20 years. I'd have to refresh my memory and look. But what we did see is that forested area in Thurston County actually is increasing. And over a short over time periods, maybe not that long a time period. And so there are forest area, and some of it is, you know, what is kind of the pattern. We had a lot of very heavy forestry activity that occurred, a lot of clearing that occurred historically, and things are being managed a little bit differently now. So we are seeing increase in reforested and forested areas in most recent time periods that we're looking at. And of course, if you go back very far in time, we had Thurston County was a lot more forested than it is today. So it really does depend on kind of what time frame you look at.
And when you say forested, how does wildfire relate to that? So if we have a large wildfire in Thurston County, the forest is damaged, is that still considered forested land, even though there are no trees there for 10, 15 years?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So I would say for something like the Learn tool, so as part of this research effort, we looked at a couple of different inventories that are out there around forested lands. And we ended up using the Learn tool, or recommending that be used, because it ties in really closely, really well with those greenhouse gas reporting protocols that we use for these other sectors. But there's other information out there that's a lot more detailed and gets into the quality of forest, the range of the impact of disease and fire and those things, and could get into that. So for something like with the Learn tool, with using this aerial tool, if you had a major fire that came through and really changed a large area of forest, when they come back and do the next aerial run, they would see it as probably, depending on the condition of the forest, they might see it as not being forested any longer. And so that is a little bit of a risk, or just something to be aware of that's built into these aerial assessments, is that they don't have a lot of context for what kind of management or activities are happening on the land. It would just say it was forested at the first time we looked, and it's not there the second time. It would probably categorize, if it was really mown down, it would look like it was grassland or pasture land or some other land use category. And that would probably be registered in the Learn tool as a reduction in carbon sequestration because of that. But it wouldn't, for example, say, oh, this fire happened that released all that stored carbon into the atmosphere. It wouldn't calculate that change. There are some pieces of the Learn tool that look at that a little bit, but I don't know, we're a little bit less confident in that data. But there are other information sources, really, really good ones out there that do track that information. I just want to give a note that there are other folks working on this question who provide resources who can be used by our local jurisdictions to further this work. The Department of Natural Resources has done a lot of work lately to rethink about how managing forests for climate change, how that impacts the work that they do. They've incorporated some of that into their most recent planning efforts. They have a number of programs out there with resources that I know Alyssa's really familiar with, and that you guys have projects associated with, which are great. Their urban forest program is really, really excellent. They have this relatively new project, a carbon project, which they're testing out, which is how do they identify, maybe for some of their state managed lands, they would manage them for carbon instead of, and sell those, get those certified and sell them in carbon markets rather than manage them purely for timber harvest. The Washington State Conservation Commission has a number of programs that are looking at how to support that regenerative agriculture question. The voluntary stewardship program has it doesn't directly talk about carbon sequestration, but does talk a lot about stewardship on agricultural lands. And the Sustainable Farm and Fields program is a potential funding source for filling some of the data gaps that we have around agricultural practices. And a big one, the Climate Commitment Act, which set in place a cap and invest system in Washington State, is a potential huge game changer in thinking about these types of projects. So the focus is a lot on that you have large polluters and contributors of greenhouse gas emissions in Washington State having to either reduce those or buy credits as part of that system. But the funding for that comes out of that, there is a lot of work going into thinking about the role of carbon offsets that can be used in that. And so there's guidance out from Ecology about using carbon offsets with protocols associated with them that are tied to reforestation, avoiding forest conversion, improving forest management, livestock management, lots of different things, very closely modeled on programs in California and other places. But a big caveat with that goes back to our assumptions at the beginning with the climate plan, is that there's a lot of excitement around these kind of carbon credit projects and the economic benefits, how they can really help quantify the economic role benefits of these ecosystems. But if you create a carbon credit for, say, a forest in Thurston County, and it goes into one of these markets where it's used as an offset for someone else's activity in the Climate Commitment Act, and that it's offsetting an activity that's not occurring in Thurston County, then we've kind of lost it, right? If we can't use it again to be offsetting our own emissions. And so that's something to think about. There's definitely a potential issue for double counting. Our forests and agriculture and prairies are a huge resource for us locally in so many ways, but including in the value that they provide in offsetting greenhouse gas emissions. So just wrapping up, what we found is that existing forests and trees in Thurston County sequester around 927,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide a year. But that's only part of the picture, and we could use a little more data to get to a complete baseline. Based on what we looked at, the targets that are in the climate mitigation are really, really ambitious. They're going to be very, very difficult to achieve. And partners might want to reconsider the role of carbon sequestration in that overall mix of how we achieve that, those goals. But partners we've provided a menu of different options that folks can think about and how to move ahead in the carbon sequestration space. And those range from really doing some advocacy on the state level and how to manage those lands and what kind of incentives to provide, down to thinking about things like tree inventories locally. So there's a lot of big and small actions that can be taken. And I will wrap it up there.
Question, Allison. Of course, the climate change issue is a global issue. Some of it is geologic, volcanoes, we can't do anything about. Sunspots, we can't do anything about. But what I understand from what you're saying, some of the fundamental problems and what I've read elsewhere are that there are too many cows and too many humans that are creating carbon. If no animals existed on this planet, there would still be issues from volcanoes and things like that. But is there anyone working, I assume, on a national or global level, talking to the world about population control? I went to college in the 70s. Paul Ehrlichman, Ehrlich wrote The Population Explosion Bomb, the population bomb. And in the 70s, science was saying human population growth is going too fast to be sustainable. In your presentation, I don't hear any reference to education programs, taxation programs that would encourage people to limit family size so as to reduce carbon emissions generated by human beings. Is that part of anything, or is there a partner working, like the health department, on issues related to population growth?
And it's a great question, and you're certainly not the only one who asked it. It often comes up in discussions around this. I would say, so a couple of things to think about. I definitely didn't talk about it in this presentation because it's very focused on carbon sequestration, part of the climate mitigation plan. And I'd say they're definitely, it's a little bit out of my area when it comes to thinking about global population growth and how that affects the overall picture. For the climate mitigation plan, what I'll say is that we're very focused on what is our part? What is our, yes, this is a global issue, and Thurston County, even all our jurisdictions together, is a really, really small part of it when you think about what we contribute. And also, but we are going to be feeling the impacts locally. And part of the guiding principle for the climate mitigation process is that we should be doing our part for what we can to not be contributing to this global issue. When it comes to population growth, then in our region, growth is not coming because of births. It's in migration. So our region is one of the fastest growing areas of Western Washington, and Western Washington continues to be one of the fastest growing areas of the United States. But that is not driven by birth rates. That is driven by people who are like, gosh, what a great place to live. I want to be there. That's why I'm here. Probably many other people that you know. And so that's not, it's definitely, it's not part of our plan because that's not something that we see as what's contributing to our local emissions.
I have a great example if you'll give me a moment to pull it up. Are you all familiar with the Climate Inroads project from MIT?
No.
Take a second to get it up on the screen, and I will share it once I get it there. People in Zoom land. I think that this is a really helpful educational tool that only looks at feasible options on a global level. So I'm just going to set it up here. So here you see temperature increase. So this is looking at global temperature change. And each of these is a little toggle tool that you can use, and you can get into greater detail. So for population, if the population growth continues at status quo, with all of these other things remaining the same, we would reach 3.3 degrees centigrade global temperature average increase by 2100. If we have highest population growth, 3.5, but if we do the most feasible lowest growth, it only decreases 0.1 degrees. So something that's really cool about this tool, and I really encourage everyone to play with it. This is something that I love playing with, and they update this on like a weekly basis. MIT, the order in which you do all of these different actions matters, and the extent in which you do them. And to give the spoiler, you have to do all of them to the maximum amount feasible to actually keep us at 1.5. You have to do everything.
Is there any one that's more significant than 90% of the others?
Efficiency in transportation and the energy supply being renewable makes the biggest dent, and the carbon price makes the biggest dent.
Carbon price.
Carbon price, so a tax on carbon. So see this, we're at lowest population growth and highest carbon price. We're down to 2.2 degrees increase now. If we increase renewables and energy efficiency in transportation and buildings, and over here you can see this mix of our primary sources of energy, and you can change this to be so many different things. Carbon, you can look at land, forestry, and food. Temperature change is the one that I like because we all think about or at least I think about 1.5 often and 2 degrees. Afforestation, 0.1, so about the same amount as the population growth. You can toggle into any of these and get into more detail. So this is lowering the amount of people in 80 years than what would be business as usual now, but not immediately, but into the future. And they won't let you lower this beyond what is feasible and humane, as well as in other parts of this tool. So I encourage you to take a look at this tool if you would like and play around. See how fast you can get to 1.5.
So what I hear you saying is, if you do all of them to the max, we still won't make it.
No, if we do all of them to the max, we will make it.
Okay.
If we do anything less, we will not keep it below 1.5.
Okay.
And these are all feasible, updated weekly by MIT scientists, making sure that every bit of new research and data is being incorporated into this.
Great tool.
I think it is too.
What's it called?
Climate Inroads, so
Inroads.
EN-roads. If you just Google Climate Inroads and make sure it's going to the MIT one, I don't think there's any other fake inroads. But it's fun to play with on a regular basis, and you can really get into it. So for afforestation, let me go to deforestation. So reduce deforestation. Have this in the way. So that didn't make a change, actually, depending on how everything else is, but you can go into the toggles and change it percentage per year. You can go into the detailed settings in terms of food waste reduction, deforestation, food for animals, start of the year of that policy, years to achieve it, reduction in mature forests. Like, you can go into all of these and get really into it.
Wow.
So whenever you have a question about what will this solution do in terms of the global issue, I think that that's one of your best places to go, because you can see it in real time and you can look at it in whatever way helps you conceptualize the issue better. I like to look at the fuel sources and the temperature change, but you can look at the greenhouse gas load. You can really get into it and play.
Thank you.
I do have one question for this carbon sequestration. Like, I know you were looking at Thurston County as a whole. Did you guys take into account like all the traffic moves just through that might just like, you know, the amount of emissions through trucking or just passive vehicles going through Thurston County?
It's not coming through. Allison, did you
Trent?
hear him?
You did cut out a bit. Let me see if I think I might have got it. Like, did we consider, I think I heard truck through traffic. Was that one of them?
Yeah,
Kind of
basically just the
broader
traffic
economy?
that moves through Thurston County. Yeah, was that taken
Yes.
into account as well? Or?
So, it is not included in our overall, the way we've done it to date. We at Thurston Regional Planning Council do look at traffic counts, and so we've made a decision to exclude traffic that goes through Thurston County, and you know comes in and goes right back out without stopping. So we exclude that from our overall transportation emissions. The idea being, like, we don't have a lot of control over that locally. That's going to be on the state to fix as part of their work.
All right, that makes sense. I'm just curious.
One other thing that I wanted to bring to Jim's question earlier about population control. Drawdown is, and I can lend you drawdown whenever you want to have it in my queue. It's a comprehensive look at global climate change and quantifies different actions that we can do as a world. And there is a large section on educating and empowering women. That does have tangible benefits in that regard. Any other questions for Allison?
No, it was good.
Thank you very much.
No.
That's great.
Allison?
Thank you all.
And by no means do you have to sit and watch the rest of our.
I'm
meeting
very
as we go through
curious.
that.
I'm gonna stay. I'm staying.
You're welcome to join us. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is the urban forest inventory. Can Jerry speak to that?
The inventory? So,
If I can just follow up, Trent, internally, what I understood from what Allison told us and what Alyssa's telling us is that the Tumwater Tree Board, yes, we need to advocate for trees and the environment, but we're not the most significant player in reducing climate change in Thurston County. It's important that we try to increase the canopy and maintain the canopy for climate change. But there are other players that can have a bigger impact on climate change than the Tumwater Tree Board.
Yeah, I think that's
That may be
true.
obvious.
That's kind of, although all great things, I mean, it's always good to have more forest and more canopy and all that, but yeah, I mean, until we stop driving, there's not a whole lot that's gonna happen. We really have to cut down on our emissions. Trees are not gonna get us out of the problems that we have.
Right.
I did get a question via email from Tanya, who was unable to, her mic's not working, but she is here with us. And I'm just gonna read her question out loud. It may be a question for Allison, it may be one that I try to answer, and it could be one that I ask community development folks to answer, but I just wanted to make sure that, since she can't speak here, that I relay the question. So Tanya's question, in the recent plan to develop the parcel at Kingswood commercial proposal underlined does not align with what she is reporting as the goal for our county in protecting our forests. There is 108 trees on the 9-acre parcel, and the developer only has to save 31 trees. As we know, mandating the developer to replant the trees will not be the same quality of trees, and they will not help with carbon offsets, as the trees will take years to reach the size of the ones removed. Will there be any plans to save more existing trees in Tumwater? With all the huge projects coming up, I have not seen anything that is changing the way that these developers will be clearing trees or city changing requirements. I can try to answer this, and Allison, if you have anything to share as well, by all means. So we were making progress with those codes that are unfortunately on hold while we wait for the wildland urban interface. That would have changed the way that these developments would have to have had accounted for the trees and figured out how many they needed to have, and that would have been based on the larger sized trees having more credits. Smaller sized trees can still sequester carbon, but it takes a little while. And there are different kinds of trees that do sequester more, but that's not part of what we're asking in terms of the tree selection right now. Perhaps that's something that we could continue to talk about for the ordinances coming forward. But then sometimes there is a trade-off between the habitat value of the tree and the carbon sequestration value of the tree, and where we want to hold the most importance for our code. So because those ordinances are on pause right now, because of the wildland urban interface, which I don't think anyone is pleased about that pause, if that helps, no one's pleased about that pause. They're still following the rules that are in place right now and not the more progressive rules that we were working on. When those are adopted, new developments will be required to look at that and comply with those, but since they're not formally actually adopted yet, because we don't know if we can legally do that with the Wildland Urban Interface Code, the developments going through right now are still held to the older standard, which we're actively working on improving. There's just very annoying, delay in that progress. I don't know if that answered your question, Tanya, but for right now, the developments being proposed can only be held to the standards that are actual city code at this time.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, I mean, if we could save more trees, that would be great, but if we could make our buildings more efficient, would probably help as well. And like with the increase in the building codes, and I think there's a new energy code standard that has been put off a couple times now. I think it's like, it might even be that March 15th date now. Maybe it's part of the overall. It's like drastically increasing the efficiency of heating. That's going to help probably more trees would be great.
I know,
Being able to
check my email.
reduce our consumption.
Bonnie said, thank you for reading my question. It's exactly what the other tree board members stated, so. So if it's all right with everyone, I can move on to the next agenda item.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, this is agenda item for the Tumwater Published Urban Forest Inventory. A number of months ago, I had informed you all that I had applied for a Department of Natural Resources grant to do 6 urban forestry management plan actions in one go. We were awarded that grant. We have a contract with Davie Resource Group. We put out a request for proposals. Davie Resource Group was the only the only agency that responded. We have entered into a service provider agreement with them, and they are kicking off their work tomorrow on my first day of vacation. Thank you to Mike and Jim, who are going to go visit the consultants as they have done. They're going to start tomorrow at the other fire station and the Pioneer Cemetery. And because I am not a tree professional, they wanted tree professionals to make sure that that you all looked at what they were producing and made sure that it was okay, so they didn't get too far down the rabbit hole of collecting data and you all weren't fans of it. So thank you for being tree professionals to help make sure that the work is quality. You all have expertise that I do not, so thank you for that. So in here, I put a lot of documents, some of which I do not imagine you would read line by line each of the contracts, but I wanted to make sure that you had them so that you had reference. To the grant agreement, we have to complete the work by April 20th. We got given federal money, so we have a quicker turnaround time. The state passed through federal funding to us for that. In the service provider agreement, which has the scope of work from the consultant, which I will scroll through here, as well as the DNR minimum tree inventory data. So because our project is funded by DNR and it does include, it's mostly an inventory, or a good large chunk of it is an inventory, we have to meet their minimum data requirements because DNR is now compiling all of these smaller inventories into their own data set. So our data has to speak to their data in the exact way that they want it. We can have additional fields, and we will have some for maintenance, but making sure that exactly how we have to have that is how we have to have that. So I've already shared with you the actions from the Urban Forestry Management Plan that this seeks to do. To work on, this is the timeline. So the consultant will, I will be, because of action H from objective 7.1, I will be trying to recruit volunteers to help ground truth the 2018 street tree inventory. We have been adding new trees to that inventory as they're planted, but we have not been able to keep up with the trees that may be removed or removed and replaced. So this is going through tree by tree to everything in the street tree inventory. Is it the same tree? Is the tree still here? Is it a new tree? Measure the tree, collect all the data. Definitely not the most efficient, but you all wanted volunteers to help with that, so that's where I wrote it in for the grant, to do that part so that the arborists can do the other work that they're better suited to do. So between probably late this month in December, I'll be trying to get volunteers to go do that ground truthing because the consultant needs that information by the end of December in order to put together their maintenance report, which is another action. And here I know I'm jumping around a little bit, so slow me down if you need to. I did have a little extra tea today. Between October 10th and December 9th, the consultant will collect news data in places like the fire station and City Hall. They'll be going to every single tree and spending time with that tree, collecting the minimum data and a little bit extra. In places like Tumwater Hill Park, they will be doing a sample-based approach. And all of that collection will be happening ideally between tomorrow and December 9th. And then they'll switch gears to putting together the forest maintenance report. So they will put together methodology and inventory results. They will conduct an iTree analysis. This iTree analysis is helpful for us because I've been instructed to try to create a nexus between stormwater and urban forestry, and iTree will estimate the stormwater value and the amount of stormwater intercepted by our urban forest, so that helps create that nexus. As well, it will actually, using iTree, will estimate the carbon sequestration amount and value of each of these parcels. We'll compile that into a GIS story map where people can click onto the different city-owned parcels, and it'll tell, okay, this was inventoried at this time, there are this many trees, there's this much carbon being sequestered on this property at a value of this, there's this much stormwater being intercepted on this property at a value of this, and there's another ecosystem service that's also calculated from iTree that I'm forgetting at the moment. It'll have a value of that parcel in terms of forest, which is not the total value. There's some things that can't be monetized and some things that iTree doesn't do in terms of ecosystem services, but it's a good start. We hear a lot about people wanting to know about carbon sequestration, and we want to have that nexus of stormwater to help us do that. The consultant will develop a maintenance prioritization strategy. That was another action in the urban forestry management plan. They will provide cost estimates for maintenance work and create a planning strategy for improving tree canopy equity. So the maintenance prioritization and the estimates will help us plan out work for future years. This timing is really good for our budget cycle so that we'll actually have a good value of how much to estimate or ask for the maintenance. There might be some maintenance that we haven't been able to do, some maintenance we didn't know we needed to do. But we'll have a solid figure and a report to tie to that to make the case to get that funding. And we'll have a schedule. A lot of our tree maintenance work has been reactive. We're trying to get proactive, as the urban forestry management plan suggests. It'll either be a 4 or a 7-year maintenance schedule. It says 4 in the plan. The consultant is suggesting that some may be a 7-year maintenance schedule, so we'll have conversations on that, I'm sure. And the planning strategy for improving tree canopy equity, there's something called a tree equity score. Have any of you heard of it? Pull it up. It is done through America's Forests, and it looks at a number of different socioeconomic aspects of life in our community, and correlates that with tree canopy and gives us a score for different parts of our city. So different parts of Tumwater have higher tree canopy equity scores. So that's people who are poor and working class, might be disabled, people of color, how much access they have to tree canopy. We have some with higher scores, some with lower scores. Of course, the airport has lower canopy. But we're trying to improve the overall tree equity score, and in those areas where it's low, as well as separate from the tree equity map from the Washington State Department of Health tracking network map or the environmental health disparities, look at where our overburdened communities are and how much canopy there is in those areas, and try to make canopy accessible to all. So this will be a planning strategy for where we should be adding more trees, so that people who don't have access to trees for any number of reasons have access to trees in the future, and we know where to put them. We do have those tree canopy goals from the urban forestry management plan. We'll compare those with that and try to figure out some incentives. I think I've mentioned to you all that we did get a federal grant, which I incorporated some of those incentives that I produced a memo about earlier in the year into that to help us, again, get better tree canopy equity, but then also help people retain trees. and I can share more information on that federal grant, after this item if you want. But that will hopefully get us the urban forester. It pays for half their, salary and benefits and some incentives, for 5 years. So this project should be done in February. This is the grant agreement, just for transparency's sake, shared it with you. The boring legal documents. So the consultant is going to look at every city-owned property except for the golf course. I couldn't get them to want to be pelted by golf balls. So they're looking at everything but that. In the future, of course, we can put out another request for proposals and see if we get someone that's a taker for being potentially pelted by golf balls, since they count every tree. I'll scroll here. This is a list of locations. So some are city buildings, some are parks. We're looking at water reservoirs, stormwater sites, lift station sites, wells, basically everything but the golf course that the city owns. It will have a count.
Does the contractor have a better address for some of those sites? I hope.
Yes, we gave them GIS data when they got
Okay.
onboarded, so they have much better than that, but all of these sites. So many acres, many trees, and hopefully having a count of all of those trees or a sample-based approach will help us maintain more proactively, be able to forecast the costs and do better, and set up that urban forester so that they really know everything that's under their jurisdiction.
And why were these sites not included in the 2018 survey?
I can't speak to that.
Okay.
I think because we were doing the street tree plan at that time, and that was a big focus. This project is $60,000. I'm not sure what budget was allocated for the street tree inventory to begin with.
And parks, are parks included
Yes,
yet?
yes,
Oh, in this?
yes.
Okay. They weren't in the previous one.
No, the previous one was just street trees.
Yeah.
Only street trees.
And parks already has an inventory?
Not of this,
Okay.
caliber.
Okay.
They have a list of some trees, many trees, not all trees, but many trees in each of the parks. That was done in 2020. And the species, the number, and the general condition in a Word document. This will be much more detailed, have GIS. They'll be going through ISA related maintenance needs and quality ratings. That is the inventory. Any other questions, concerns on that? I will likely reach out to all of you when we do that volunteer street tree ground truthing. You are not required to help, but I would love your help. I am also going to be reaching out to the students that were participating from Tumwater School District in the Forest and Stream program. Their teachers have expressed interest in wanting them to continue their skills, so we might have that group of kids that went through the training over the summer that might help. It'll likely be weekends or afternoons if the students want to do it after school. Still waiting to get the software from our consultant. We have it. They sent it to Jim, Mike, and myself for us to look at, but in terms of getting onto lots of other people's smartphones, I'm still waiting for that part before I can start planning those days and times. But you all are tree experts, and I would love your help, but there is no pressure or requirement.
Is there any thought that we will ask homeowners to tell us what they have on their land?
Not for this one. This one is
I
very,
mean, 10 years from now?
I don't think that's an action in the urban forestry management plan, and there's quite a few actions I have to accomplish from that. So perhaps my priority is to complete the council adopted plan.
My understanding is the vast majority of the land in Tumwater is privately owned. So what percent of the canopy is represented by our survey? Give a sense of that?
So the tree canopy assessment also happened in 2018. I'm not sure when you were referring to
Right.
it earlier, if that was
Right.
the same thing. So that's using aerial imagery and
Right.
remote sensing to look at the percentage of canopy, and when we do that again, I don't recall if there's a time frame for the frequency at which to do that, but when we do that again, we can ask our GIS staff to look at privately owned parcels versus commercial or residential, privately owned versus publicly owned, the city or other public entities that own property in the city. We could ask them to break it down by that.
But I'm guessing that our survey represents 20% or less of the canopy of Walmart.
Not sure.
Okay.
Oh, that's good.
The DNR grant just, will be opening again for next year's application. I'm honestly a little swamped, and I'm not sure what to apply for or if I will apply this year. It comes around each year, but it is kind of a big year for funding for DNR. I have been attending the webinars to see what they will be funding. So if you want to brainstorm items from the Urban Forestry Management Plan that you would like pushed up to the top of the list, please let me know. Submitted almost $1 million in grant requests this year, so I would love a little brainstorming from outside of my brain. And then here's the minimum required data collection attributes for the inventories. A lot of these are the same ones that we had in the street tree inventory. Some of these are new, but easy to get for the street tree inventory, and that's something else that the consultant will be doing. Will be ground truthing, but they'll also be kind of renaming and filling in some of this stuff.
DBH is the new term?
Well, DSH is the term that we're using in our ordinances.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not gonna fuss at DNR about this since they gave me a sheet on exactly how they wanted it. But in our work,
Yes,
DSH.
new term for me.
Well, not everyone who might be assessing a tree is standing.
For sure.
So breast height could be different if someone's
For
in a
sure.
wheelchair or standing.
4.5 feet.
Yes, the standard 4.5 feet. Sarah, would you like me to move on to the next item? The next and last item of the agenda, I realized that we had quite a bit of flux in our schedule this year. And I apologize if I wasn't best at communicating that we weren't having 2 meetings still. I scribbled it on a piece of paper and sometimes forget to actually talk to humans, so I apologize for that. But this is what I think is our schedule for the rest of the year. Because Amita, you all had requested Amita present on their interns, they're not available in December, so I switched things up a little bit where in the past, in November, we had that meeting with directors about the Urban Forestry Management Plan progress in terms of implementation. I've moved that to December, if that's okay.
Good.
So tonight, obviously, we're talking carbon sequestration, tree inventory project, and the meeting schedule. Next month, we'll still be meeting on the Mondays, no Tuesday joint meeting stuff until after March for sure, when the Wild and Urban Interface Code is maybe finalized. So November, you'll hear from Anita. I'll give you an update on the tree inventory project. I'll give you monthly updates on that every month while the project is going on. And then I'll give you the dwindled down incentives memo that you all asked for earlier in the year. Sorry, it's taken me a little while, but I'll give that to you. And then December, we'll have our directors or any other representatives from the city departments that touch and manage trees. They'll be here, and I'll give you another tree inventory example. Of course, by all means, if any of you or if members of the public recommend or heritage trees, that'll be added to what's already here. Or if there's any other items that you all would like to make sure get on the agenda in the next few months, either tell me now or tell me later. I generally start working on the agenda 2 or 3 weeks before the meeting. So any comments, requested changes or issues with this? I'm gonna look at my phone and see if Tanya.
That December meeting, that's just a second Monday, right?
Yes.
Okay,
All of these are Monday nights.
All of
second
these are
Mondays.
Mondays,
yeah,
second Mondays.
okay.
Yeah, this seems fine.
I just did the schedule that you all. Sorry?
I just said I don't have any problems with this.
That was the last item on the agenda.
All right. So our next tree board meeting would be 11/13/2013. I'm gonna make a motion to adjourn this meeting. All those in favor? Aye, all right.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nobody. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy your vacation,
everyone.
Melissa.
Thank you.
Probably well deserved. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
How long